So today is generally a day, meaning Palm Sunday, is a day that we wave our palms, right? Usually the choir processes in, and it's a day of joy and singing, right? And so I still want it to be a day of joy and singing, but I want to take a little bit different look. The way the calendar falls, we do Palm Sunday, and then we do Resurrection Sunday, and we kind of skip the crucifixion in the middle, right? Really, to be honest with you, Palm Sunday is of little importance compared to the crucifixion, and yet we skip it because of the way the days work. So this year, I want to do it differently. I want to not talk about Palm Sunday, but I do want to talk about the day that Christ was crucified. Now, I know that you guys know the mechanics of the thing, right? I mean, you understand that this was not a mistake, that this was planned before the foundation of the world, that God knew at creation that man was going to sin and there needed to be a payment for that sin. God cannot be a just God and then just say, well, doesn't matter what you do. Go ahead, murder, lie, gossip, anything goes. There has to be a payment for that sin, and we, because we are the sinners, have no way to pay for that sin. And so the cross was planned from the beginning so that God himself would come to earth and pay the penalty that we owe. And you know how it worked. You know all about the guards calling him king and hitting him and spitting on him. You know all about the gambling for his cloak. You know all about the sun being darkened and the curtain being torn. You know all of that stuff. But what we don't really pay attention to closely is what the people's reaction was that day. And so what I want to do today is I just want to look at the people in this chapter and say, how did they react? And how does that relate to us? And how is it that we react to the cross of Christ, to God in our lives? So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take 5 people that we see. And before anybody says, I know what's going to happen, is I'm not going to talk about the women at the foot of the cross. And I know that some of you are going to come to me later and say, there's women at that cross too, you know. And you're right. And I'm going to talk about that next week. So cut me some slack. So here we go. We're going to talk about the 5 people and what kind of people and how they relate to us. So the first person I want to talk about is a conflicted man. And if you're taking notes, that's the first blank is conflicted. We have a conflicted man, and of course I'm talking about Pontius Pilate. Pilate was a Roman. He was the military governor of that area. I've told you in the past couple weeks that there was an insurrection going on. There were rebellions. And so there was a strong Roman military presence, and Pilate was the top dog of the Roman military. What he wanted was 2 things. He wanted justice, and he wanted peace. And so he had a decision to make. The Jews bring Jesus, and they say, we want this man crucified. And Pilate says, well, in verse 14, he says it very clearly. And Pilate said to them, why? What evil has he done? But they shouted all the more, crucify him, crucify him. And so Pilate is conflicted. He doesn't know what to do about this Jesus. He wants to do the right thing. He really does. He knows the right thing to do. He wants to do the right thing. But of course he doesn't. Instead, he chooses to listen to the crowd. He chooses to do the expedient thing for peace instead of doing the right thing that he was supposed to do. We know in our lives as well, we are often conflicted in what we ought to do. Oftentimes, well, not what we ought to do, but what we're going to do, right? Many times in our lives, we will find ourselves facing a decision. Am I going to do what I know is right? Am I going to do what God is calling me to do? Or am I going to do what is easy? Am I going to do what's expedient? Am I going to do what's more comfortable for me? That was the decision Pilate had to make, and that's the decision that we have to make today. You know, we like to call Jesus the Prince of Peace, right? And he is absolutely the Prince of Peace. And we like to think of how he comes and he brings joy and happiness to our lives, right? You guys are all with that, right? I'm right. Yes, absolutely. Yes, Lord. Come, Lord. Bring joy and peace and happiness. Jesus said, I come not to bring peace. I come to bring a sword. Jesus knew that those that followed him would suffer for it. He knew that he was dividing families, he was dividing friends, he was dividing churches, he was dividing people from other people, as some people choose the right thing and some people choose what's expedient. And we, today, often have to make that choice. We often are conflicted. And so you have to ask the question, when you choose, when you are in a situation where it's the right versus the expedient, who will you follow? Will you be a Jesus follower, or will you be Pontius Pilate and make the decision that's easiest or more comfortable for you? The second person that we're going to talk about is really representative of all of us. I know for sure we're all guilty, and that's the second point in your outline, is a guilty man. And of course we're talking about Barabbas here. I had a friend in college, she wanted to write a book called Whatever Happened to Barabbas. I never saw that book, but maybe she wrote it, I don't know, maybe it just wasn't that popular. But Barabbas, as we read here, as Mike just read to us, he was supposed to be the one on the cross. Jesus took Barabbas's cross for himself. And in the same way, Jesus took our crosses, right? We sang just a minute ago, were you there when they crucified the Lord? And the answer is yes. We were there. We were there because it was our sin that he took to the cross with him. And so we, just like Barabbas, are guilty. And Jesus was on the cross instead. Now, we don't know what happened to Barabbas, right? I would love to be able to sit here, and honestly, there's two main traditions about what happened to Barabbas. The first one is Barabbas turned his life. He said, Jesus is God. I am so grateful that he took my penalty upon himself and began to walk and follow. I hope that's true. The other tradition says that Barabbas just went the other way, that Barabbas, he was released. He immediately went back into the insurrection again and started killing Romans again and was then executed just a couple months later. I don't know what the truth is. But in our lives, we face the same decision, right? Once we come to a point where we know that Jesus took our place on the cross, now we have to decide what are we going to do with that, right? We've been freed from guilt. We've been freed from sin. We have a new relationship with life because of what Jesus did on the cross. And now the choice that we make is, what are we going to do with that life? We can choose to follow God. We can choose to be his people. We can choose to learn and grow and serve and worship. Or we can say, like some do, I'm freed. I can do whatever I want. Right? We all know people like that who had a religious experience when they were in their teen years and then just kept doing whatever they were going to do. They just walked away from the faith. They walked away from God. And they don't feel bad about it because they're free. God has freed them. Well, just like with Barabbas on the one hand, there were consequences to that. If it's true that he went out and just was killed again. But there's also good consequences to come for those who follow Jesus, who choose to be the people that God's calling them to be. So what about your lives? Think back to the point where in time, where at some point you made a decision to be a Jesus follower. Hopefully we all have that time in our lives. It doesn't have to be a big emotional thing, you know. It doesn't have to be like mine when I went to the rock concert. I told you the story before, and wow, my life was changed immediately and miraculously and noticeably. Maybe for you it was more of a gradual thing. But at some point in our lives, hopefully everyone here has made that decision and has understood that Jesus took our place and he took our guilt, and we are free because of what he did. What did Barabbas do then? I don't know. It's not important. It's important to Barabbas, but not to us. What's important is what will you do now that you have a choice to choose or not. So the first person was Pilate. He was a conflicted man. The second person was Barabbas. He was a guilty man. The third person I want to talk about is Simon. Simon of Cyrene. You know the story again. we say we know the story, but the truth is we don't really know much about Simon, right? We know basically one line. He was there for the feast, right? It was the Passover. Jerusalem was packed with millions of people coming to do their sacrifices, and Simon was one of them. And as he was trying to get to where he was going, one of the guards grabbed him and said, "Carry the cross." Jesus had been beaten so badly he was unable to carry the cross. Now, when I say carry the cross, it's not the picture that you probably have in your mind. When it was carry the cross, it didn't mean the whole cross, right? You see pictures of people that got the cross over one shoulder, right? And they're kind of dragging it around, right? Probably not. Probably it was just the crossbar of the cross, which was still big. It still probably weighed about 100 pounds. It was a board, probably about 7-8 feet long, just long enough for someone to be able to put their hands out to get tied or nailed to it. And the prisoners would have to carry that crossbar to the place where they were crucified. Then, when they got to that place, their hands would either be tied or nailed to the cross. And then they would take ropes and they would pull that crossbar up to the top of the post, which was permanent and always sitting there. And they would pull them up onto the cross. And then once they got there, then they would nail or tie their feet onto that post as well. So the picture that we have is of a big long board that Simon was carrying. Interesting historical, but not really where I want to go with this. What I really want to go with this is Simon is a family man, right? I love the detail of the New Testament. I love reading the Bible and seeing these details. And in verse 21, it says, "And they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross." The father of Alexander and Rufus. Why is that in there? Well, I presume it's in there because the readers of the book of Mark, the people that Mark was writing to, knew who Alexander and Rufus was. And sure enough, if you read through the book of Acts, you will find a couple of Jesus followers named Alexander and Rufus. Were they the same ones? I can't really say for sure. But I can say that the people that Mark was writing to would know who they were, and so that makes sense that they would be that Alexander and Rufus, which means that they were Jesus followers as well. And when we choose to be Jesus followers, the point I want to make is it's not just us that have our lives changed. Our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren, with the decisions that we make today about whether or not to follow Jesus, roll down through the generations. Is that a guarantee? Is it your fault if your child's not walking like they ought to be walking? No. When people become adults, they get to make their own decisions. But still, it affects future generations. That's the point I wanted to make here about Simon. Is I don't know who Simon was. He was Jewish, obviously, because he was there for the sacrifice. He didn't seem to be a Jesus follower. Maybe he was, I don't know. But the point is, when he became aware of what Jesus was doing, what happened with Jesus, his heart seems to have been changed, and he brought that change of heart to his sons, and they became Jesus followers as well. Simon was a family man, and his godliness, his faith, impacted his children, his grandchildren, and beyond that. Finally, we have two more, but next we have a guy we don't even know his name. All right, we don't know who this guy is. All we know is he's called the centurion. And we see that the centurion is there. The fact that he's a centurion means he's a guy with some authority. He's got a guy with some education. He's not a poor guy by any means. He is the captain of a 100-person squad of the Roman army. Right? He's got 100 people under him. So he's a man of some, heft in the community, in that Roman community. He's on execution duty that day. Right? I don't know how often he was on execution duty. I don't know if that was his normal thing. But of course, this is a time of war and a time of insurrection. And so if they're going to be executing people who may be a part of that insurrection, and remember that was the charge against Jesus, that he was part of the insurrection to overthrow the Roman emperor. So the centurion was there to make sure that Jesus' followers didn't come to rescue him. That's why they would have an armed guard there, to make sure that the execution went through as planned. I assume that the centurion had probably seen hundreds of executions. They weren't rare, right? Executions were common in the day, and not always by crucifixion, but if it was insurrection, if it was a rebellion against the Roman government, then that's why they crucified people, because they wanted to make it as terrible as possible. They wanted you to have the worst possible death you can imagine, and that's what crucifixion was. So the centurion, he's there, and he's seeing what's going on. He probably doesn't care much. He doesn't know who Jesus is, I would think. Maybe he's heard stories or whatever. He's not interested in the politics of the day, why do the Jews want this guy dead so bad? He doesn't care if he even knows. He may not even know. What he knows is, my orders are, this guy's got to die. That's what he's going to do. But things happened. And God moved in a powerful way. The sun got dark, thunder rolled, the curtain got torn. The centurion realized that this was the Son of God. That's what he says, 39. And when the centurion who stood facing him saw that he thus breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. The centurion was an honest man. He didn't have an axe to grind, but what he saw was God moving, and he acknowledged that. And too often we today see God moving and don't want to acknowledge it. We don't want to say that this is God moving in our lives, because if we say this is God moving in our lives, then we have to make choices. We go back to being conflicted Pilate, right? Where we have to make a choice because we know what God is saying, we know what God is doing, we know what God is calling us to do. We see God moving, he's calling us to join him, so we deny that it's God. Now, I do that. I'm guilty of that. Because there's times I don't want to follow what God is doing. And so I say, oh, no, that's just coincidence. That's not really God calling. And it could be just a little thing. Maybe you guys do the same thing. But in this case, we should be like the centurion, who is open when God intervenes in a way that we know that it's God. We need to be open to following and to acknowledging that it's God that's moving in his life. Would you do that? If God moved in your life, would you do what he's calling you to do? Would you respond, or would you make it, no, it's wrong, that can't be God? Tough question. All questions today. Have you noticed that? Each one of these people brings up a question in our lives of how are we going to respond? That's really what the message is. How are we going to respond to the crucifixion of Christ? The greatest event, perhaps, there's argument in my own mind. Was it the crucifixion or is it the resurrection? The crucifixion, which is the greatest event? And the truth is, it's the same coin. Without the resurrection, the crucifixion doesn't mean much. Without the crucifixion, the resurrection doesn't happen. We need both of these things. It's important that we take the crucifixion of Christ more seriously than I think sometimes we have a tend to do. And finally, I want to talk about Joseph of Arimathea. Joseph is a faithful man. And I didn't have Mike read this. I think you all know the story. Joseph was a powerful man. He would be analogous to one of our congressmen today, right? He was on the Sanhedrin. He was learned. He was rich. He was powerful. He was respected in his community. And in secret, he was a Jesus follower. At first not. At first he was simply open-minded. But as he studied and as he watched what Jesus was doing and as he heard what Jesus was saying, he became a Jesus follower. But in secret. He didn't want anybody to know because he had a lot to lose, right? How much did he have to lose? Well, Jesus is getting crucified. And it's very possible that a purge would start when all of Jesus' followers would be crucified. And he might lose his power, and he might lose his wealth, and he might lose his position, and he might lose his regard in the community. And so he had a lot to lose, and so he kept his Christianity secret. But when the time came, Joseph of Arimathea found the courage to go and ask for Jesus' body, and then he worshiped Jesus by giving him his own tomb. Now again, that seems like a small thing, doesn't it? Doesn't it seem like, really, well, that's nice. A little too late there, Joseph, right? But the truth is, that's an important piece of the gospel, because the fact that Joseph took Jesus' body and put it in his tomb, first of all, fulfilled the prophecy of just that happening, but second of all, people knew where the body was supposed to be. If Joseph hadn't have done that, Jesus' body would have been taken away with the other criminals, and who knows what they would have done with it. And then the women wouldn't have been able to go to the tomb on Sunday morning to find out. The role that Joseph played in this story is very important. Small, but very important. And the role that we play in the story, the 2,000-year story, is also very important. Small. But God has a plan for you. God has a plan to use you for his glory today, this week, this month. And we need to decide, are we going to be faithful? Are we going to put aside the fear? Are we going to be courageous and stand up and not be a secret Christian anymore? I think too many Christians today are secret Christians. I think we prefer not to be known as Christians in our workplaces or in our schools or in our clubs. We prefer to be just nice guys. How about that Jim? Oh, he's a nice guy. But I would rather them say, well, he's a little bit Christian-y for my taste. Right? That's what I want. I want to be known as a Jesus follower, and I hope that's what you want to be known as well. A faithful follower of Jesus, even if there's conflict, even if there's something that you have to lose, something to give up. We want to be people who perform what God has given us to perform when God gives it to us. Joseph didn't really have a role before this, but when the time came, Joseph stood up and did his part. And that's what this is calling us to do, is to be faithful Christians who, when the time comes, will stand up and do our part. I don't know what that looks like for you today. I don't even know what that looks like for me today, necessarily. But when it's time, we'll know, right? God will communicate to us when our time has come to do the thing that he is calling us to do. Will we be ready, and will we be willing? The cross, the greatest event in human history, the ultimate service as God himself becomes a man to pay the price that we owed. And now, incredibly, he chooses us to be his people and be part of his story. Let's do that this week.